The irony of America's inconsistent international position, financial leadership, and political indifference or hostility was not lost on the American public. Franklin D. Roosevelt made much of the contradictions of Republicans' international economic policy in the 1932 presidential race, comparing it with the fantasy world of Alice in Wonderland. A puzzled, somewhat skeptical Alice asked the Republican leadership some simple questions. Will not the printing and selling of more stocks and bonds, the building of new plants, and the increase of efficiency produce more goods than we can buy? No, shouted Humpty Dumpty. The more we produce, the more we can buy. What if we produce a surplus? Oh, we can sell it to foreign consumers. How can the foreigners pay for it? Why? We will lend them the money. I see, said Alice. They will buy our surplus with our money. Of course, these foreigners will pay us back by selling us their goods. Oh, not at all, said Humpty Dumpty. We set up a high wall called the tariff. And, said Alice at last, how will the foreigners pay off their loans? That is easy, said Humpty Dumpty. Did you ever hear of a moratorium? And so at last, my friends, we have reached the heart of the magic formula of 1928. The first pillar of social democracy in Sweden was counter-cyclical demand management, government commitment to alleviate the business cycle. Social democratic government went further, attempting to reduce the amplitude and frequency of the cyclical downtowns in general to maintain full employment. They used monetary policy to keep prices from falling or rising too much, and fiscal policy, that's government spending and taxation, to sustain economic activity. Sweden's government took longer to use its second major macroeconomic tool, fiscal policy. Even many who advocated looser monetary policy believed that deficit spending was folly. The country's leading economist, Gustav Kessel, argued that if government borrowed heavily for job-creating public works, the effect would be that the private sector supply of capital will dry up or at least be curtailed to the highest conceivable degree. Kessel's colleague, Eli Hescher, believed that private enterprise used money better than governments and that deficit spending was bad medicine. Eli stated, it was the kind of medical treatment which used to be applied by market horse traders with old nags for sale. They gave them a half a stoop of aquavit to make them pirate as they had done in the springtime of their youth, only to revert, of course, to their former sloth once the intoxication wore off. John Maynard Keynes was well known for his polemics on Versailles and the gold standard, and for his analysis of how government mishandling of monetary policy had contributed to the ills of the era. In 1936, he wrote the following: the ideas of economists and political philosophers are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economists. In Keynes' words, an individual may be forced by his private circumstances to curtail his normal expenditure, and no one can blame him. But let no one suppose that he is performing a public duty in behaving in such a way. The modern capitalist is a fair weather sailor. As soon as the storm rises, he abandons the duties of navigation and even sinks the boats which might carry him to safety by his haste to push his labor off and himself in. To some, Keynes' ideas were almost Marxist in their reliance on government, but as he noted, his message was profoundly anti-Marxist because it allowed the government to overcome the weaknesses of the capitalist economy by borrowing and spending heavily on not only on the devastation of war, but on the enterprise of peace in order to stimulate demand and change expectations relied upon by the capitalists. Keynes' inspired reformist zeal was reflected in the memories of a Cambridge student who called the development of the ideas in the general theory, joyful revelation in dark days. We thought that Keynes had found the flaw in the capitalist system and had proclaimed its remedy. The mystery of contemporary iniquity had been unveiled by the masterpiece of sustained intellectual effort. Thus, the general theory was to us less a work of economic theory than a manifestation for reason and cheerfulness. It gave a rational basis and moral appeal for a faith in the possible health and sanity of contemporary mankind, such as the youth of my generation found nowhere else. In the United States in the early 1930s, Eustace Marina Eccles was one of a group of iconoclastic businessmen who argued for government to assume major fiscal tasks in a way that later became known as Keynesian. Eccles, a provincial banker with a high school education, was blunt. A bank cannot finance the building of more factories and more rental properties when half of our productive property is idle for lack of consumption, and a large percentage of our business properties are vacant for want of paying tenants. The government, however, can spend money because the government, unlike the bankers, has the power of taxation and power to create money and does not have to depend on the profit motive. The only escape from a depression must be by increased spending. We must depend upon the government to save what we have of a price, profit, and credit system. Eccles was appointed head of the Federal Reserve in 1934 and held the post until 1948. The most important task for those who wanted to lead the post-war world towards greater economic integration was to ensure that the United States was engaged. Lynn Fraser, president of New York's First National Bank, insisted as early as 1940 that there was no reason to delay tackling three principal evils: economic nationalism, trade barriers, and war. He argued that these three disgraces go hand in hand and always have. To give profound consideration to our public policies concerning them, even while a battle is raging, is really not so incongruous, so impotent, or so inappropriate as it appears, any more than one should desist from inquiring into the fundamental causes of a plague while people are dying of it. The socialist experience that must have captured the imagination of the developing world took place in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution gave socialism a toehold off the shore of the world's capitalist power base in the former playground of America's upper classes, for far from the Eurasian center of communist power. Cuba had been a U.S. dependency formally and informally since American troops defeated the Spanish army in 1898. By 1950s, the island was as well off as Chile in Latin America, yet to many, Cuba seemed a grotesque parody of development. The corruption of the country's political leaders was matched by the decadence of Havana's hotels, casinos, and brothels. Dependency on the United States may have enriched many Cubans, but it did not alleviate the grinding poverty of many others, such as the landless farm workers or the inhabitants of sprawling slums surrounding the cities. Showy wealth in the midst of poverty, dependency, and nationalism created deep-seated Cuban resentment toward the island's ruling class and its American protectors. Fidel Castro and his 1,000 or so fighters entered Havana on January 1, 1959 without opposition for the brutality of dictator Faxon Batista had, after 25 years of misrule, run its course. In the early 70s, communists ruled unchallenged over both the world's largest country and its most populous. Despite the bitter division between USSR and China, the prospects for socialism seemed good. Socialist central planning, which first appeared to be a temporary strategy for the Soviet Union to prepare to fight off foreign invaders, had established itself as an alternative economic order. Capitalism appeared to require a sacrifice of social conditions to accelerate industrialization, but the centrally planned economies seemed to have achieved both growth and social equity. Karl Marx certainly did not envision a socialist camp made up mostly of poor countries, and Vladimir Lenin would have been disappointed that the only developed areas under communist rule had been annexed by military means. Yet communism ruled 1/3 of the planet and had millions of adherents. On Friday, August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon and his economic team slipped out of Washington to the presidential retreat Camp David for what Herbert Stein, a member of the Council of Economic Advisers, described to the presidential speechwriter William Safire as follows. This could be the most important weekend in the history of economics since March 4, 1933. Safire, who had little background in economic issues, thought hard about the reference and came up with his best guess. We closing the banks? Referring to Franklin Roosevelt's bank holiday during the darkest days of the Great Depression. Stein laughed and elaborated, hardly, but I would not be surprised if the president were to close the gold window. Once Nixon and his advisers gathered, Secretary of the Treasury John Connolly presented the issue. What's our immediate problem? We are meeting here because we are in trouble overseas. The British came in today to ask us to cover $3 billion, all their dollar reserves. Under the Bretton Woods monetary order, other governments could redeem dollars for gold. Since they expected that the dollar would be devalued, its gold value would be reduced. It made financial sense to unload as many dollars as possible. Domestic political imperatives overpowered international commitments, and on Sunday, August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon took the dollar off gold. Over the next few months, the dollar dropped by about 10%. In 1973, the Nixon administration again devalued the dollar by 10%. Trade moved into surplus. The economy picked up speed and unemployment declined. Major financial powers attempted to patch together a reformed Bretton Woods system, but this was effectively defeated by the second dollar devaluation in 1973. The IMF staff circulated obituary notice in the fund's Washington headquarters. Rest in peace. We regretfully announce the not unexpected passing away after a long illness of Bretton Woods at 9 p.m. last Sunday. Bretton was born in New Hampshire in 1944 and died a few days after his 27th birthday. The fatal stroke occurred this month when parasites called speculators inflated his most important member and caused a rupture of his vital element, dollar, gold convertibility. After nearly 30 years, the balancing act between national economic concerns and international economic integration had failed. The future president of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, argued that Brazil cannot isolate itself anachronistically with an outdated policy of autarky which runs the risk of turning it into a huge Cambodia. Kenneth Kaunda led the Zambian people to independence and ruled for nearly 30 years after liberation. Despite his political effectiveness during the struggle for liberation and an apparently sincere dedication to his people's well-being, he presided over a catastrophic economic failure. Born in 1924 in the northern stretches of the British colony of Northern Rhodesia, the future Zambia, Kaunda graduated from the only secondary school in the colony open to Africans and began work as a school teacher. The 1920s saw two important developments. First, the British South African Company's charter in southern Rhodesia, the future Zimbabwe, expired, and white settlers took control of the self-governing colony. Second, copper was discovered in northern Rhodesia. By the early 1940s, northern Rhodesia had a booming copper sector, and southern Rhodesia's white-run agriculture was thriving. During the 1950s, anti-colonial African activists squared off against both white settlers and the British government. The British wanted to merge northern and southern Rhodesia, along with Nyasaland, now Malawi, into a settler-dominated federation. Kaunda and other Africans opposed federation vigorously, largely under the leadership of the African National Congress, ANC. After federation in 1953, Kaunda became the ANC Secretary General. For 5 more years, he was one of the organization's top leaders, promoting everything from boycotts of segregated shops to civil disobedience. As editor of the ANC's magazine, Kaunda was arrested and served a 2-month term of hard labor. Eventually, he found himself at odds with more moderate groups in the ANC and later breakaway Zambian African National Congress ZANU. Arrested again by the British in 1959, Kaunda emerged from prison to lead a new United National Independence Party. In 1964, as the federation splintered into component parts, Nyasaland into Malawi, Northern Rhodesia into Zambia, and Southern Rhodesia into white-ruled Rhodesia, Kaunda won handily a free election for Zambia's presidency. Anti-globalization protests challenged the economic order from the outside, but the most serious threats to the system came from within. The most globalized component of the international economy, finance, seemed to be its weakest link, as the global financial system was hit by wave after wave of currency and banking crisis. How had one of global capitalism's greatest promises, access to open international capital markets, turned into its greatest threat? The answer to this question goes back to Canada in the 1950s. The Canadian economy was very tightly tied to that of the United States. Money flowed freely across the Canadian-US border, and trade with the United States was crucially important to Canada. This presented Canada with a trade-off akin to that faced later by globalized economies. Canadians wanted a stable and predictable US dollar exchange rate to facilitate travel, trade, and investment, but they also wanted their government to control Canadian monetary policy so that it could lower unemployment or reduce inflation as necessary. The two goals were incompatible. With one Canadian dollar freely exchangeable for one US dollar and money free to move from Canada to the United States, whatever interest rates were in the United States, they had to be in Canada. If money markets paid less in Canada, people will take the money out of Canada and into the United States until the rates rose. Canada was so integrated into the US economy that if its exchange rate was fixed, it could no more have an independent monetary policy than Illinois could. So Canadians had to choose which they valued more, a stable exchange rate or an independent monetary policy. In the 1950s, they chose the latter. In 1962, they went back to the former. The Canadian controversies over how to deal with this early globalization experience engaged the interest of a young Canadian economist at the IMF, Robert Mundell. In the early 60s, Mundell systematized the Canadian problem as the dilemma of a financially open country. He pointed out that a country financially linked to others had to choose between having its own national monetary policy on the one hand and having a stable currency on the other. It could not have both. If Canada tied its dollar to the US dollar, it had to have American monetary policy. If it wanted its own monetary policy, it had to allow its currency's value to fluctuate. Mandel's impossibility theorem, sometimes called the unholy trinity, showed that countries could only have two of the three general desirable things: capital mobility, a stable exchange rate, and monetary independence. If capital was free to move into and out of a country, fixing its currency to that of another country was like adopting the other country's money, and that meant accepting the other country's monetary policy as well. In the 1990s, the Mandel dilemma had ceased to be a theoretical curiosity and had become the central reality of international money and finance. Mandel's analysis was vital to understanding global capitalism and to his recognition with the Nobel Memorial Prize in the economics in 1999. Most countries were now integrated into the international financial markets, so the Canadian trade-off was nearly universal. Either give up control over national monetary policy or give up a stable currency. The issue was neither a gain nor academic to people desperate for both stable currencies and locally appropriate policies, forced to choose between them. The benefits of global capitalism come together with its costs. Companies borrow cheaply on international financial markets. This exposes them to the demands of foreign investors. Trade lets consumers buy inexpensive foreign products. This brings unwanted competition for domestic producers. Multinational corporations bring new technologies and methods. This drives domestic firms out of business. Foreign debt allows governments to spend more than they take in. This can lead to excruciating debt crisis. Governments open their borders to the world economy and provide some citizens the potential for wealth and success. This can consign other citizens to hardship and distress. There is no trade without competition, no finance without risk, no investment without obligation. There is no way to avoid the trade-offs inherent in global capitalism, and there is no generally accepted moral yardstick to weigh the suffering of a worker whose job was lost because of globalization against the benefits to a worker whose job depends on globalization. International economic integration generally expands economic opportunities and is good for society. The great alternatives to economic integration failed. Attempts to seal countries off from the rest of the world economy in the 1930s was ultimately disastrous. Germany, Italy, and Japan closed their economies and also turned towards dictatorship, war, and conquest. The poor countries and former colonies that created closed economies in the 30s and 40s collapsed into economic stagnation, social unrest, crisis, and military dictatorships in the 70s and 80s. Few countries have achieved economic progress without access to the international economy.